In this video, I'm going to teach you the Vienna opening. This opening is the best opening you can play with the white pieces up to 2000 level. It is solid, it is easy to play, it has many traps, and most likely your opponent will not know what to do. You have to have the white pieces and begin with e4, the king's pawn. In this position, your opponent must play e5 and now you can play the Vienna. Now instead of developing this knight, you develop this knight here, protecting the pawn. And this is the Vienna game. In this position, your opponent has two main responses. One is copying you and the other one is playing knight here, attacking this pawn. First, let's look at knight here. When your opponent plays here, then you have two main responses. Either you can play here, develop your knight here and castle, go here and play normally, or you can play what I recommend. You can play the Vienna Gambit. You play f4, gambiting this pawn. If your opponent takes this pawn, he loses the game. This pawn cannot be taken because now the knight has no squares to go. If the knight goes here, you take. Here, you take. If the knight goes here, you take with the queen. So your opponent has to go back. If your opponent goes here, pinning your pawn, you simply do this and you counter the pin, and now the knight has to go back. So in any case, now the knight has to go back, and as soon as your opponent goes back, you play the move knight f3 first. This move is important so that there is no queen check. If you just play here, the queen can come here and you'll have to move your king, which is fine, but that's not what I recommend because that gets really tricky. So you go knight here, your opponent goes here, and then now you develop here, and on the next move you take this pawn and you go here with the bishop, you castle, and the rook is open. So you have attacking ideas on this pawn. Your opponent is lacking in development and you're completely winning. So that is if your opponent takes the gambit. If your opponent takes the gambit, you run him up with the pawn, he goes back, you develop your knight, you develop this pawn. If your opponent ever attacks, you simply capture. If your opponent takes here, now if you take back with the pawn, your opponent will trade your queens, and now you don't have much of an advantage because the queens are traded and you can't attack. As you can see, it's only 0.3. So after your opponent takes your pawn, you go queen to e2, pinning this pawn to the king, and now your opponent cannot take your bishop. And now on the next move, whatever your opponent plays, you can castle queen side. If you simply take this pawn, it will be hard for you to castle because the queen is here, and as you can see, it's equal. So in this position, after you do all of this and pin this pawn, you castle queen side. And then on the next move, you will take, unleashing an attack on his queen, and then you will continue attacking and you'll potentially win the game easily because you have a dominant position. Now, what if your opponent rejects the gambit? Your opponent can reject the gambit in a few ways. Your opponent can go here, protecting the pawn. Your opponent can go here. Your opponent can go something like this. First, let's see what happens if your opponent protects his pawn with the knight. This is actually a blunder because in this position, you take the pawn, and after knight takes, you go d4, striking back in the center of the board. And now you have two pawns in the center and you continue to bulldoze the position, and your opponent will completely be restricted and will be losing because you'll develop your knight here. And in this position, you are dominating because you have your knights out, your pawns control the center, your bishops will come out, you'll castle, you have the open file for the rook, you'll attack, and you will destroy the king who is simply sitting in the corner waiting to be attacked because in order to castle, the bishop has to go here. If the knight goes here, you ruin his structure and black is in a lot of trouble. So the black can't go here. What if black goes here? Now in this position, it is best for you to play knight here, putting pressure on this pawn. Your opponent will go here to reinforce. You'll go bishop here, pinning the knight to the king. Your opponent should now take. If your opponent doesn't take and plays a lazy move, you simply take take, and after this, you simply win a pawn. Even if your opponent goes here, now you can't win this pawn, because now if you try to win the pawn, your opponent also gets a pawn, so be careful of that. If your opponent goes bishop here, then you simply go here, reinforcing your center, and then on the next move, you will castle your king. Now I will show you the main line of the Vienna Gambit, which if your opponent knows theory, he will do. The main line is to go d5, striking back in the center of the board, and this is the only good move for black. In this position, you will take this pawn, attacking the knight, and now the knight will have to move here. The main line in this position is to develop your knight, but my recommendation is to go queen to f3. Now you're threatening to take and win the pawn, so your opponent will take, and you take with the b pawn. Taking with the c pawn, d pawn is also fine. You have an open bishop, you can attack, but I recommend taking with the b pawn, because on the very next move, you can go d4 and have this center, which is very, very strong, and you will be dominating in this position. The main line in this position for your opponent is to go d4 to try to ruin your structure. And in this position, you should go bishop to c3. Sorry, you should go bishop to c4, not c3. I'm sorry. Bishop to c4, threatening checkmate. Your opponent will go queen e7. Now you can take, and now you'll simply go here, have a good position, and you'll potentially win the game. You go knight here, you castle your king, you ruthlessly attack your opponent, and you win the game, and you're clearly better. This is if your opponent goes knight here. But what if your opponent goes here? Believe it or not, this is not a very good move for black, and in this position you simply go bishop f4. If your opponent tries to copy you, your opponent loses the game to queen g4. This move attacks this pawn and threatens to take the rook on the next move. In this position, the best move for black is to go king f8, which is really, really counterintuitive. If your opponent goes here, this is actually a blunder. Your opponent will think that he's protecting the pawn and threatening this pawn. But in this position, you play the brilliant knight to d4, sacrificing the pawn. With check, your opponent takes the pawn, you go here, and there is no checkmate, and white is better. Now, white is threatening this, forking the king and the rook. White is threatening this and taking the rook. There are too many threats for white, and the idea in this position is to trap this queen. Let me show you how. If black goes here to defend this, you go knight h3, attacking the queen. The queen cannot go on any of these three squares because of our knights and our pawn. So the queen has to go here, only move, threatening the bishop. Now you play d3. And now on the next move, c3 traps the queen. Your opponent may try to go here and counterattack your queen, but you just take. And then you threaten this. And this queen cannot escape. If he goes here, the bishop takes here, knight takes here, rook takes. And on the very next move, you go c3. And now your opponent's queen is trapped. Another move is this. And in this position, your opponent has really weakened his dark squares. You have to be really, really careful of this bishop, by the way. So in this position, after this, you have to go here and threaten checkmate, because if you leave your queen here and play a lazy move like this, your opponent will go d5, threatening the queen and this bishop, and now you will lose material. So after this, you go queen here, attacking the pawn and threatening checkmate. Your opponent will go here to protect against checkmate, and in this position, you go knight to e2. The reason why this move is necessary is to prevent this knight from jumping in. Because if you play a lazy move like this knight will jump in, and now you are pushed back and no longer winning. So in this position, you have to go knight to e2. And after this, the game may go like this, castles, And because this knight is very weak, you have to be mindful and attack and pin this. This is, if your opponent ever plays this move is necessary to win the game. Because after this, there is no way your opponent can protect this knight. If your opponent goes here protecting, you simply go here. And now you win a piece and win the game. Your opponent can go here, simply up a piece and win the game. So this line is no good for black. Remember, in this position, you go queen here and you win the game because you're threatening too much. Queen here is a blunder. Knight here is a blunder too because you simply take and then your opponent has to go here, and that's really, really ugly. You go here, you hit him with the bishop and stuff like that. What if black plays the two knights? In this position, you simply go d3. On the next move, you go f4. You'll develop your knight here. You'll castle. You'll pressure this pawn. You'll pin this knight. And the game plan is simply to attack like that. Sample game might go like here, 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 castles, here, here. Remember to win this bishop too. If your opponent ever plays this move, you go here with the knight and you win the bishop. And after this, you castle. And this move is very, very necessary in the Vienna game. Taking this bishop, whenever your opponent goes here, simply just go here and take the bishop. Because after this trade, there is no pressure on the dark squares. And now the game plan is to attack this weak pawn. You'll do that by playing moves like bishop here, retreating back with the bishop. And moves like going here, bring your knight back, stacking up the queen. Maybe you can go here and rook left here and attack like this with the rook. And these are the general ideas in this position in the Vienna. There are other things which your opponent can play. For example, this. But if your opponent plays something like this, just go here. And if your opponent transposes into this, you go queen here. And if your opponent plays a move like this, you simply play the two knights. You go here and here. And then whenever your opponent goes here, you just simply take their bishop. All of that. If your opponent plays a stupid move like this, you're simply better in the opening. You go here, you have two pieces developed. Your opponent has this, his dark squared bishop is blocked in. You will go, if your opponent ever comes here, just go f4. There's no need to prepare it by this move, with this move, and take the center of the board. And this is all that is in the Vienna game. Playing the Vienna game will get you into a winning position, and it is up to you to navigate the middle game. I can almost guarantee you 70% of your games, you'll get a winning position because your opponents do not know what to do. Smash that subscribe button, like the video, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.